In this video, I will show how I remove the epoxy paint from the control joints in my basement floor and then fill them with patch material so that I can lay vinyl composite tile, otherwise known as VCT. In a previous video, I ground the epoxy off the surface of the floor. I decided to try a couple of different techniques to see if I can get that paint out of my control joints. I start off using a flexible disc that I happen to have laying around that I originally purchased to strip paint off of the fenders of a utility trailer. So this method is actually working pretty well, but as you can see, I'm wearing through this disc fairly quickly, so I gotta track down some more. Turns out this is called a 3M clean and strip, and I found some replacements, and I think this is the same product. This was considered a D1, and there's no marking on here to that effect. There was also a D2. I couldn't see a difference between the D1 and the D2, but I went ahead and bought 5 of the D1s. So I'm having a little difficulty getting the epoxy off from the very bottom of my control joint. So the first thing that I'm trying is an abrasive wheel that I purchased last week that has sort of these nylon fibers with grit embedded in them. And that seemed to work a little bit, but it just didn't get quite narrow enough to get all the way down in the bottom. And for what it's worth, it's made by this company called Nyalox. So what I did is I took an abrasive wheel that I would normally use in my 4-inch right angle grinder. And you can see it, I picked one that's already worn pretty well. And the reason I picked this one is it's kind of thin. So I took one of the nuts from it. Actually, this is the nut for the sanding pad. I used it so that it would self-center, because the mandrel on my 4-inch grinder is metric, and I didn't have adequate hardware laying around. So I took a 7/16 inch bolt, and I just backed it with a flat washer and a lock washer. So I'm just going to try this as an experiment. Now the reason I'm doing it this way rather than just using my right angle grinder directly is I want to be able to control the speed. I want to run this thing relatively slow. Because I think if I put this thing in my right angle grinder, for one thing, it's going to make a huge mess, and two, I'm just going to wind up grinding away concrete. And what I'm really trying to do is to be a little bit more methodical and careful about it. So my plan is to kind of just very carefully work my way at this to see to see if I can actually affect a change without ripping up my concrete too much. So the grinding disc was working kind of, but it was actually making the concrete a little bit smooth. It was kind of, burnishing it, and it wasn't getting down there deep enough. So then I just decided to try a sacrificial screwdriver, and that was actually kind of working, right? But I was clearly just wearing a screwdriver down. So what I thought I would do is I would try using, some files, because they're much harder, and I tend to keep my files forever, so like this file, if you can see it, it's probably beyond its useful life, really. So what I thought I would do is I would try to get down in there, and it was like not quite fitting. So then I switched over to a small rat tail file. Same kind of thing, these files I've had these files for like 20 years. And then what I'm noticing is a little harder to hold on to, of course, but I'm definitely able to get in there and chip away. some of the epoxy that's at the bottom of the control joint. Okay, so after experimenting around with files and things, I think I came up with a better method to actually get the epoxy from down in the bottom of the control joints. And then I switched my technique up a little bit more to try to get the epoxy out of the bottom of the control joints first, and then using an abrasive wheel to get the epoxy out of the upper part of the joint. So what I ultimately discovered is that actually just an ordinary 3/16 inch screwdriver, in this case, you know, one that was well worn, so it's now sacrificial, I just come along and start a little higher and find that the epoxy is actually a little bit brittle. So the idea that if I start up a little bit higher, I'm just tapping along using a 12-ounce ball peen hammer, which I'm choked up on pretty good. I can just tap along a little bit higher up to begin with, and then from the other side, just work along a bit, just to kind of break that bond. It's a little bit brittle. I'll just show a little bit of a section here. And then actually using a different kind of disc just to clear it out. Now I can go at a slightly steeper angle and just see it's starting to chip out of there. See? Now it looks tedious, and it is. But what I'm finding is this is actually moving along a lot quicker than the other methods. Just trying to use a file, or you know, you can't get down in there with my abrasive wheel all the way to the bottom, but I can get down in there with a file. But I find that if I do it after the fact, the epoxy starts to get a little bit gummy. And by doing it first, like I'm doing here, it stays, I guess it's thick enough where it's a little bit more brittle, and I can get it out like so. So you can see it there, it's out pretty well. And then what I can do is now I can follow up with my abrasive wheel. And I can get the majority of the paint out of the control joints. Another characteristic of epoxy paint, you know, it's pretty tough. And as you can see here, I got a chip, reasonably flexible, but it's also, you know, it's tough and somewhat flexible. It's still kind of brittle. So this can come in handy because I have a few locations where the grinder wasn't able to get low enough to get a few spots of paint off the floor, and I didn't want to just keep going after it, because then I'd have uneven spots on the floor. I didn't want to grind down too low, in other words. But if you take a spot like this, for example, I can go after it with my abrasive wheel and my drill. But another technique is it's just very brittle. So just taking a ball peen hammer, just going to demonstrate, just tapping away at it and flip it over and use the ball side. You can see it's starting to flake up. You can see it's starting to flake. Now, I wouldn't want to go over big areas this way, but the point being is that for some of these smaller areas, if you're using a floor grinder, I think it was a good idea to just leave those alone rather than continuing to grind out the floor. If you found this video useful at all, please give me a like below and comment either way. Subscribe to my channel to follow along with me as I finish my basement. And if you do, you get to see me in the next video. The next step is to fill the control joints. And for that, I'm using this product called UZIN NC886 Skim and Repair Compound. I don't know how well I'll do this, but it's basically a real fine, no shrink grout. So my equipment's pretty straightforward. I set down a small piece of cardboard just to minimize the mess a bit. I'm using a 1-gallon ice cream bucket just to mix it up, and I take a shop towel and I just wipe out the excess just to make it a little easier to work with on the next couple of batches. It takes 2 parts compound to 1 part water, and for that I'm using this Pyrex measuring cup, which has been working really well. I have a gallon jug of cool water. I have a can and a little scoop if I need to add some additional compound to thicken it up a little bit if I put too much water in. A roll of shop towels and a roll of paper towels. So when I get done adding the water, I take a wad of paper towels and I dry out the measuring cup real good so it's ready for next time. I also have a bucket of warm water standing aside just for cleanup in case I gotta make a mess. For my application and mixing, I'm using a putty knife, probably like 2.5 inches stiff. It's obviously used, been around a while, and I'm using a pair of cotton, basically mason's gloves, just to keep most of the gunk off my hands as I hold the bucket and so on. All right, so I'm about to mix up the next batch. So I'm gonna go ahead and don my gloves here, just to just to minimize, protect myself a little bit here. So just a couple of scoops, getting pretty close. Trying to pay attention to the 8-cup line a little bit. Not to breathe stuff in too much. Dust mask would probably be warranted. I'm gonna go a little shy. I'm finding that the stuff being a little on the dry side is actually better. So I'm gonna go a little drier this time. And then probably could add the water first. Now, the one thing I'm gonna do right now is, while I have the thing wet, I'm gonna just take a wad of paper towels here and dry this thing out to the extent that I can. Set it aside so it's ready for next time. Take my putty knife. It looks like there's too much water in it to begin with, but once you start mixing it in good, it stiffens up pretty nice. Anyway, you can see the consistency here. It's about like, I don't know, frosting on a cake, I imagine. Something about like that. I think it should be maybe a little stiffer. And if you've got really narrow control joints or cracks you're trying to fill, maybe a little thinner. but I put down a couple applications so far, and I'm finding that a little stiffer, maybe even a little stiffer than this would be good. Okay, so the first thing I'm doing now is I'm getting my compound pressed down inside the joint, just to make sure I get it down in there real good so I get good adhesion. So there we go again. So I'm just pressing some compound deep into the joint. Trying to work out any air bubbles and things. Trying to get it nice and tight to the bottom. And get rid of any air bubbles, so on. Work it in from the other direction. I'm just kind of actually scraping a knife off on the edge of the joint. I'm working like a foot at a time. So making sure that I have kind of a ridge of compound. And then I start off a little bit tall. I'm going to start my wipe. Low angle to the knife, modest pressure. The key, I think, is trying not to overwork the compound. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrape off the ridge here, putting a little more pressure on the concrete side, the non-blunt side, so just scrape it off. So I was able to do about 50 linear feet of control joint with a 10-pound bag of this compound. So, okay, that's about as much as I can get out of here. So, let's see what we do now. Just going to scrape it off in the bucket. Modest pressure, shallow angle. Scrape off the excess. And I'm done with this batch.